February 13, 1945. Dresden, Germany. The prisoners stood behind electrified wire watching smoke rise from Hamburg 200 kilometers to the north. They had been watching smoke rise from German cities for 6 months now. Each night brought new fires on distant horizons. Each morning brought rumors of which city had burned. The men wore striped uniforms with letters stenciled across their backs. RAF. Yuzov. Some had numbers tattooed on their forearms. Others had yellow stars sewn onto their clothes before the stars were removed and replaced with prison stripes. They were British bomber crews shot down over the Ruhr. American fighter pilots who'd crashed in Bavaria. Polish resistance fighters captured in Warsaw. Russian soldiers taken at Stalingrad who'd somehow survived the death marches west. And they were kept alive by people who wanted them dead. The guards wore field grey Wehrmacht uniforms. They were old men mostly. Grandfathers who'd fought in the First War and been called back for this one. Their hands shook when they raised rifles. Their backs bent under the weight of equipment they'd carried 40 years before in different trenches under different flags. Between the prisoners and guards stretched a space measured in meters but defined by hatred so complete it had its own geography. The prisoners watched the guards with eyes that recorded every cruelty. Every withheld ration. Every casual beating. Every friend who died in the wire trying to escape or simply too broken to continue living. The guards watched the prisoners with something more complicated than hatred. Fear mostly. These were the men who'd burned their cities. Who'd killed their sons and brothers and fathers. Who'd destroyed everything Germany had built and reduced the fatherland to rubble and ash. The guards had been told these prisoners were terrorists. Criminal airmen who murdered women and children from the safety of high altitude. War criminals who deserved no mercy under any convention. In Stalag IVB outside Dresden, 5,000 prisoners lived behind wire. British aircrew who'd been shot down over Berlin. Americans who'd bailed out over Leipzig. French resistance fighters transported east. Jews from a dozen countries who'd survived selections at Auschwitz only to be force-marched west as the Red Army advanced. Political prisoners whose only crime was speaking against the Reich. Criminals whose only crime was being in the wrong place when Germany needed slave labor. They lived in wooden barracks that leaked rain and held no heat. They slept on wooden boards with paper-thin blankets. They received one meal each day. Watery soup and bread so black and hard it had to be soaked before eating. The Red Cross parcels that were supposed to arrive each week came sporadically if at all. The guards said the parcels were being stolen by partisans. The prisoners knew the guards were eating them. The camp commandant was a man named Hauptmann Friedrich Müller. He'd commanded artillery in France in 1940. He'd lost his left arm at Smolensk in 1941. He'd been assigned to guard duty because one-armed men had limited use at the front. He ran the camp according to regulations established in Geneva Conventions that Germany had signed and then largely ignored. Müller enforced the rules about roll call and labor and punishment with the precision of a man who believed rules were the thin membrane separating civilization from chaos. He did not beat prisoners personally. He did not withhold Red Cross parcels for his own gain. He did not execute men without cause. These small mercies did not make him humane. They simply made him a different kind of complicit. The prisoners organized themselves according to nationality and rank and whatever hierarchies men create when stripped of everything else. British officers maintained rigid discipline among their men. Americans formed committees and held votes. Russians who'd survived Stalingrad simply endured with the patience of men who'd already seen the worst and knew they could survive anything short of immediate death. And they all hated the Germans. Hated them with the focused intensity of men who had nothing else to focus on. Hated them for the war. For the camps. For the dead friends and burning cities. For every indignity suffered behind wire while guards watched with rifles and dogs. The guards hated them back. Hated them for the bombs. For the nights spent in shelters while cities burned. For the telegrams that arrived with news of sons killed in Russia or wives buried under rubble in Berlin. For the collapse of everything Germany had promised them. For making them guards in a camp when they should have been home with grandchildren. In the city of Dresden itself, 600,000 civilians tried to pretend the war would pass them by. They'd been told Dresden was safe. An open city. A cultural treasure that would be spared the destruction visited on Hamburg and Cologne and Berlin. The porcelain factories still produced delicate figurines. The churches still held their Baroque splendor. The Zwinger Palace still housed art treasures gathered across centuries. Women pushed prams through streets lined with undamaged buildings. Children played in parks where snow fell on grass that would grow again in spring. Old men sat in cafes reading newspapers that promised victory was near. Final victory. Endsieg. The word appeared in every headline even as Soviet guns could be heard to the east and American tanks advanced from the west. Refugees crowded the train stations. They'd fled from Silesia and East Prussia ahead of the Red Army. They'd walked through snow carrying what possessions they could save. They slept in station waiting rooms and church basements and anywhere else that offered shelter. They told stories about what happened when Soviet soldiers arrived in German towns. Stories about women hidden in cellars and men shot in ditches and children who disappeared into columns of prisoners marching east. Dresden absorbed them because Dresden still believed it would be spared. Because Dresden was beautiful. Because Dresden had no military significance beyond the rail yards that transported troops and supplies east. Because surely the Allies would not destroy a city of such cultural importance. The prisoners in Stalag IVB knew better. They'd flown the missions. They'd carried the bombs. They knew how target selection worked. Rail yards. Troop concentrations. Industrial capacity. Nothing was spared because of beauty. Nothing was saved because of culture. The war had moved past those considerations years ago. On the evening of February 13, 1945, the prisoners stood in the assembly area for evening roll call. The temperature was below freezing. Snow fell in heavy wet flakes that soaked through thin uniforms. The count was taking longer than usual because new prisoners had arrived that morning. French civilians forced into labor. Belgians accused of resistance. More Jews evacuated from camps to the east as Soviet guns grew louder. The guards counted with cold-numbed fingers and tried to finish before dark. They wanted to return to their quarters. To the fires that gave minimal warmth. To the hot soup that would be waiting. To anything except standing in snow watching prisoners shiver. And then the sirens began. The sound rose from the city. A wailing that started low and climbed to a pitch that made teeth ache. The prisoners had heard air raid sirens in England. The guards had heard them in every German city for 3 years. But Dresden's sirens had been silent. Dresden was supposed to be safe. The guards looked toward the city. Toward the sound. Their faces showed confusion first. Then recognition. Then something close to terror. The prisoners looked at the guards. And then they looked up. The sky to the northwest was changing color. It happened slowly at first. A subtle lightening of the darkness. As if someone had lit a candle behind thick curtains. Then more light. Then a glow that spread across low clouds like paint spilling across canvas. The prisoners understood first. They'd flown through that light. They'd created it. Master bombers dropping flares to mark the target. Pathfinders illuminating the aim point. The first wave beginning their runs. Hauptmann Müller watched the light spread and knew what it meant. He'd seen it from below in Hamburg. In Cologne. In Stuttgart. The transformation of night into day through chemistry and high explosive. The conversion of cities into light so bright it could be seen from 100 kilometers away. He turned to his guards and shouted orders that were lost in the sound of sirens. The guards didn't need orders. They were already moving. Running toward the gate. Toward the city. Toward homes and families and everything they'd left behind that morning when their shift began. Müller grabbed the nearest guard. An old man named Werner who'd been a schoolteacher before the war. The prisoners, Müller said. Lock them in the barracks. Werner stared at him. The city is burning. Lock them in the barracks. My daughter is in the city. My grandchildren. Müller held the man's arm. Your duty is here. Werner pulled free and ran. The other guards followed. Within seconds, Hauptmann Müller stood alone in the assembly area watching his men desert. Watching them run toward a city that was about to burn. Watching the last pretense of order collapse like everything else in Germany that winter. The prisoners watched the guards disappear through the gate. They looked at the empty guard towers. At the fence with no one watching. At the road that led away from the camp. For perhaps 30 seconds, 5,000 men stood perfectly still and contemplated freedom. Then the British senior officer, a wing commander named Davies who'd been shot down over Hamburg in 1943, spoke into the silence. Nobody moves. An American captain named Morrison stepped forward. The hell with that. The guards are gone. The guards will be back. Or other guards will come. And if we're not here, they'll shoot whoever they find. Then we hide. The Red Army is 40 kilometers east. We could reach them in 2 days. Davies looked at Morrison. Then he looked at the light spreading across the sky. In 2 days, there won't be a city left to hide in. The sound changed. It had been sirens. Now it became something deeper. A rumbling that felt physical. That vibrated in bones and teeth. The sound of hundreds of aircraft approaching in formation. The sound of Lancaster bombers carrying maximum loads. The sound that every German city had learned to recognize in the seconds before hell arrived. The prisoners who'd flown those missions knew exactly what came next. First the target indicators. Red and green flares hanging in the sky like Christmas decorations. Then the high explosive bombs to blow buildings open. Then the incendiaries to burn what remained. Then more high explosives to kill the firefighters. Then more incendiaries until the fires merged into one massive conflagration that generated its own weather. They'd planned the raids. They'd calculated the bomb loads. They'd studied the photographs afterward. They knew the methodology of burning cities. They'd helped perfect it. And now they stood behind wire watching their work illuminate the night sky. The first bombs fell at exactly 22:13. The prisoners heard the whistle. Heard the crump of impact. Felt the ground shake beneath their feet. Then more whistles. More impacts. The rhythm building like drums in an orchestra preparing for crescendo. The barracks nearest the assembly area had no walls. Just wooden frames covered with paper and tar paper that provided minimal shelter from weather and no protection from anything else. The prisoners pressed against walls and covered their heads and waited for the barracks to collapse on top of them. Müller stood in the center of the assembly area watching the bombing. His left sleeve hung empty. His right hand hung at his side. He made no move toward shelter. He simply watched Dresden burn with the expression of a man watching something he'd always known would happen but hoped never would. A British flight sergeant named Coleman crawled to where Müller stood. "Sir. The shelters. Are there shelters?" Müller looked down at him. "For the guards. Not for prisoners." "Then we need to dig." "There's no time." "Then what do we do?" Müller looked toward the city. Toward the light that was now bright enough to read by. Toward the smoke column rising kilometers into the air. "We pray it doesn't reach this far." The bombing continued for 22 minutes. Each minute brought more impacts. More light. More smoke. The clouds reflected orange and red. The snow falling through the light looked like embers. The ground shook continuously now. Not individual impacts but a sustained tremor as if the earth itself was trying to shake loose from its foundation. Then silence. The prisoners lifted their heads. The barracks still stood. The fence still held. The guard towers were still empty. 5,000 men had survived the first wave through nothing except distance and chance. Coleman stood and brushed snow from his uniform. "Is it over?" Müller shook his head. "That was Pathfinders. The main force is still coming." "How do you know?" "Because this is what they did to Hamburg. And Cologne. And every other city. First wave to mark the target. Second wave to destroy it." The sirens had never stopped. They wailed continuously beneath the sound of bombs. Now in the brief silence, their sound was almost comforting. A human sound. A warning that implied someone still cared enough to warn. Then the sound changed again. Not the deep rumble of the first wave but a higher-pitched drone. More engines. More aircraft. So many the sound merged into a single continuous roar that made speech impossible. The second wave arrived at 1:23. 3 hours after the first. Long enough for survivors to emerge from shelters. For firefighters to begin working. For rescue teams to start searching for survivors. For the city to begin believing it might survive. The bombs fell for 38 minutes. Not hundreds of aircraft but thousands. Not scattered impacts but a continuous carpet of explosions that walked across the city from east to west and back again. The light became so bright the prisoners could see their shadows on the ground at 2 o'clock in the morning. The smoke column reached so high it disappeared into clouds that themselves glowed red from below. The fence began to melt. The electrified wire heated until insulation bubbled and ran like water. The wooden posts supporting the wire began to smoke. The barracks closest to the city caught fire from radiant heat alone. The tar paper roofs bubbled and ignited. The wooden frames began to burn. Prisoners ran from the burning barracks toward the assembly area. They carried what they could. Blankets. Food tins. The pathetic collections of possessions that represented everything they owned. They dumped these in the snow and beat at flames with bare hands. The Americans organized bucket brigades using water from a pump that miraculously still functioned. The British formed firebreak teams pulling down sections of fence to keep fire from spreading. The Russians simply grabbed burning timbers and threw them as far as their strength allowed. And Müller stood in the center of the assembly area watching Germans and British and Americans and Russians and Poles and French and Jews work together to keep wooden buildings from burning while kilometers away an entire city was dying. The heat grew intense. Snow melted in the assembly area. Water ran in streams toward lower ground. Steam rose where cold water met heated earth. The air became difficult to breathe. Not from smoke which the wind pushed east but from heat that sucked moisture from lungs. A British pilot named Thompson collapsed. Coleman dragged him toward the pump. Müller helped carry him the last 10 meters. They poured water over Thompson's face until he gasped and sat up. The city, Thompson said. Everyone in the city. Müller said nothing. There was nothing to say. He'd seen Hamburg. He knew what happened when fire reached certain temperatures. When individual blazes merged into firestorm. When normal fire created its own weather. When superheated air rose so fast it sucked in surrounding air at hurricane speeds. When streets became wind tunnels. When buildings collapsed inward. When people caught in the open were pulled into the flames like leaves in a whirlpool. The bombing ended at 2:01. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Because now they could hear Dresden burn. Could hear the roar of fire consuming a city. Could hear buildings collapsing. Could hear explosions as gas mains ruptured. Could hear screaming. The sound carried across kilometers. High-pitched and sustained. Not individual voices but a choir of suffering that rose and fell but never stopped completely. The prisoners and Müller stood in the assembly area listening to people die. Listening to the sound that bombing made when seen from the ground instead of from 5,000 meters up where cities looked like maps and impacts looked like camera flashes. Dawn came at 6:15. The light revealed a landscape transformed. Where Dresden had been was now a column of smoke rising kilometers high. The column glowed from within with orange light. Embers rose through the smoke like reverse rain. The smell reached the camp around 7. Sweet and heavy and wrong. The smell of burning wood and chemicals and flesh. Müller walked to the camp gate. It stood open. The guards who'd run toward the city had never returned. The prisoners who could have fled had remained. The fence that should have separated them had partially melted. The war that had made them enemies had become irrelevant in the face of what they'd witnessed. Coleman joined Müller at the gate. They stood together looking at the smoke column. Permission to organize search parties, sir. Müller looked at him. You're asking my permission. You're still the commandant. The commandant of what? The guards are gone. The fence is broken. You could leave. Where would we go? The city is burning. The Russians are coming. England is 1,000 kilometers away. Müller was quiet for a long time. Then, organize your parties. But they answer to me. British, American, Russian, everyone. Until German authority is re-established, I'm responsible for this camp and everyone in it. Coleman nodded. Yes, sir. The search parties entered Dresden at 9 o'clock on February 14. They wore their prison uniforms because they had nothing else. They carried whatever tools the camp possessed. Shovels. Picks. Buckets. They walked toward the smoke column that still rose from where the city had been. The first kilometer was intact. Buildings stood undamaged. Windows were unbroken. The bombing had missed this district completely. But everyone was gone. The streets were empty. Shops were closed. Houses were dark. The only movement was smoke drifting overhead. The second kilometer showed damage. Blown out windows. Collapsed roofs. Craters in the street. But the buildings still stood. Fire had reached this district but had been contained. The search parties passed through without stopping. The third kilometer was rubble. There was no other word for it. Buildings had been reduced to walls no higher than a man's waist. Streets were filled with brick and stone and twisted metal. Water from broken mains ran through the debris. Gas from ruptured pipes burned in blue jets that flickered without heat. The smell was overwhelming. Sweet and thick and absolutely wrong. The smell that came from burning everything. Wood and fabric and leather and paint and human beings. The smell that coated the back of the throat and stayed there no matter how much you swallowed. They found the first bodies in a cellar beneath what had been an apartment building. 17 people. Men and women and children huddled together. They'd suffocated when the fire consumed all the oxygen. Their bodies were unmarked. They looked like they were sleeping except for the expressions frozen on their faces. Coleman organized the burial detail. British prisoners who dropped bombs on German cities now dug graves for German civilians. They worked in silence. There was nothing to say. The bodies were too numerous for individual graves. They dug mass graves in a park where trees had been reduced to black stumps. American prisoners found a tram stopped in the middle of a street. The passengers were all dead. Killed by heat so intense their clothes had burned off their bodies, but the tram's metal frame remained intact. The bodies had contracted in the heat. They looked smaller than human. Like dolls. Like things that had never been alive. Russian prisoners found a shelter beneath a department store. The shelter had been designed to hold 200 people. They counted over 800 bodies. The people had crowded in seeking protection. When the fire consumed oxygen and filled the shelter with carbon monoxide, they died standing up. Packed so tightly they'd remained upright even in death. Müller walked through the ruins with a notebook. He'd been trained in artillery. He understood destruction. He'd calculated how many shells it would take to destroy a village. How much explosive to collapse a bridge. The mathematics of violence was familiar to him. But this exceeded calculation. This was destruction beyond mathematics. Where buildings had stood were now abstract shapes. Where streets had run were now obstacles. The city's geometry had been erased and replaced with chaos that followed no pattern except the physics of collapse. A British wing commander named Patterson found Müller sitting on rubble that had been a church. "We found a hospital. Or what's left of one. They need help moving patients." Müller stood. How many survived? Maybe 30. Out of 400. They walked to the hospital. The building's walls had collapsed outward, leaving exposed floors stacked like a wedding cake. Patients lay on beds that balanced on steel beams. Nurses moved between them, performing triage with equipment salvaged from the wreckage. A German doctor named Schmidt organized the evacuation. He'd been in surgery when the bombing began. He'd continued operating through the first wave. Through the second wave. Through the fires that consumed the building around him. He'd saved 4 people. The other 12 on his operating table had died when the ceiling collapsed. Schmidt looked at Müller's uniform. Then at Patterson's prison stripes. "I don't care who you are. If you can carry a stretcher, you're useful." They worked for 6 hours. British prisoners and German doctors moving patients from a burning building to a park where other prisoners had set up a field hospital using equipment carried from the camp. Americans administered morphine. Russians set broken bones. French prisoners organized supply chains bringing water and bandages from intact districts. And Müller maintained order. He assigned tasks. He coordinated movements. He rationed supplies. He exercised authority no one had given him over people who had no obligation to obey. And they obeyed because someone needed to be in charge, and he was the one willing to do it. The third wave came at noon on February 14. The prisoners and Müller heard the engines while they were still moving patients. The sound made everyone stop. Look up. Watch B-17s appear from the east flying in perfect formation. The bombs fell for 14 minutes. Not on what remained of Dresden but on the rail yards 3 kilometers south. On roads. On bridges. On anything that moved. The American bombers were hitting transportation to prevent German reinforcement. They were destroying what little infrastructure remained. They were ensuring Dresden would never be useful to German forces again. One bomb struck a column of refugees fleeing toward Prague. 200 people died instantly. The survivors scattered into fields. Some ran back toward the burning city. Others continued south. A few simply sat down where they were and waited for whatever came next. When the bombers departed, Müller led prisoners into the smoke to search for survivors. They found children separated from parents. Elderly who couldn't walk. Injured who couldn't move. They carried them back to the field hospital where Schmidt and his nurses did what they could with almost nothing. By evening on February 14, the prisoners had rescued 400 people from the rubble. They'd buried 2,000. They'd established 3 field hospitals. They'd organized supply chains bringing food and water from undamaged districts. They'd created order from chaos through nothing except willingness to work. And not once did anyone mention that these were enemies helping each other. That these were the men who dropped the bombs now digging through rubble to save the people they'd bombed. That these were Germans accepting help from Jews and Poles and Russians they'd been taught to hate. The work was too urgent for ideology. The need too great for prejudice. When a building was collapsing with people trapped inside, it didn't matter who held the rope. When a child was buried under rubble, it didn't matter whose hands did the digging. On February 15, Wehrmacht units arrived to restore order. They found Müller commanding a mixed force of German civilians and Allied prisoners. They found British officers organizing German firefighting teams. They found Russian prisoners distributing food to German refugees. The Wehrmacht colonel who assumed command looked at Müller. "What happened to your guards? They ran when the bombing started. These prisoners remained. And you let enemy combatants move freely through the city? They're not combatants. They're rescue workers. Without them, thousands more would be dead." The colonel looked at the prisoners working in the rubble. At Germans and British working side by side. At Americans and Russians sharing the same water buckets. "This is irregular. Everything about this is irregular. I'm ordering all prisoners back to the camp. Immediately." Müller straightened. "That would be a mistake. Are you questioning my authority? I'm suggesting that these men have earned the right to finish what they started." The colonel was quiet. "Then, they have until sunset. After that, they return to the camp. All of them." The prisoners worked until dark. They saved 6 more people from the rubble. They buried 400 more. They treated injuries and distributed supplies and maintained order in districts where no German authority existed. And at sunset on February 15, they walked back to Stalag IVB in groups organized by nationality. British with British. Americans with Americans. Russians with Russians. The war's categories reasserting themselves. The temporary unity fracturing as the immediate crisis passed. But something had changed. Something invisible but real. The hatred was still there. The war was still there. The camps and the bombings and all the reasons for animosity remained. But underneath was now something else. A recognition. An acknowledgement. A understanding that in the end, when everything was burning, the categories mattered less than the capacity to help. The death toll from the Dresden bombing remained disputed for decades. German propaganda claimed 250,000 dead. Allied sources suggested 25,000. Modern historians settled on approximately 25,000 confirmed dead with thousands more never identified. The prisoners who worked in the ruins never forgot what they saw. British aircrew who'd flown bombing missions wrote in their memoirs about the days after Dresden. About seeing their work from the ground. About understanding for the first time what strategic bombing meant to the people below the bomb sites. American pilots who participated in the raid but were shot down on other missions and captured spoke about the moral complexity of watching Germans dig through rubble searching for children while knowing you participated in creating that rubble. Russian prisoners who'd survived German camps and death marches wrote about working alongside German doctors to save German civilians. About how hatred became complicated when faced with actual human suffering. About how revenge fantasies dissolved when confronted with actual opportunity for revenge. And they wrote about Hauptmann Friedrich Müller, the one-armed commandant who'd maintained order through 3 days of chaos. Who'd commanded respect from men who had no obligation to respect him. Who'd exercised authority without the threat of force because force had become irrelevant. Müller survived the war. He was captured by Soviet forces when they overran the camp in May 1945. He spent 6 years in a Soviet prison camp before being released in 1951. He never spoke publicly about Dresden. Never wrote a memoir. Never gave interviews. He worked as a clerk in Hamburg until his death in 1974. But letters written by former prisoners and preserved in archives spoke about him. British veterans mentioned the German officer who'd helped organize rescue efforts. Americans wrote about the commandant who treated them as human beings during impossible circumstances. Russians noted the Wehrmacht officer who'd given orders they'd chosen to obey. Coleman, the British flight sergeant who'd helped organize search parties, became a civil engineer after the war. He specialized in disaster relief. He worked in earthquake zones and flood regions and anywhere else that needed organized response to chaos. When asked why he'd chosen this work, he mentioned 3 days in February 1945 when he'd learned that organization saved lives and that leadership came from willingness to act rather than official authority. Patterson, the wing commander who'd found Müller sitting on church rubble, returned to Britain and became involved in reconciliation efforts between former enemies. He organized meetings between British bomber crews and German survivors. He facilitated conversations about war and responsibility and guilt and forgiveness. He believed that understanding came from facing what had been done rather than avoiding it. Schmidt, the German doctor who'd operated through the bombing, emigrated to Canada in 1948. He worked in emergency medicine. He taught courses on trauma care and disaster response. He never forgot the British prisoners who helped move patients from a collapsing building. Never forgot that in crisis, training mattered more than nationality. The camp at Stalag IVB was torn down in 1947. The ground was cleared. Trees were planted. By 1960, nothing remained to indicate thousands of men had lived there behind wire. But in 2010, survivors returned for a memorial dedication. British and German and American and Russian men in their 80s and 90s standing together at a location marked only by a plaque. They spoke about the war. About imprisonment. About bombing. About the 3 days in February when categories had dissolved and all that mattered was immediate survival. They spoke about how hatred had been genuine and justified and real. How nothing that happened during the rescue efforts negated the reasons for that hatred. How working together during crisis didn't erase the war or excuse the camps or justify the bombings. But they also spoke about how those 3 days had complicated their understanding. How seeing the enemy as human didn't make them less responsible for their actions but did make the moral calculus less simple. How the capacity for both cruelty and compassion existed in everyone. How circumstances could make enemies collaborate and how collaboration didn't make them friends but did make them something more complex than simple categories allowed. The bombing of Dresden remained controversial. Churchill questioned the necessity of the raid even as he'd approved it. Harris defended it as militarily justified. German sources called it a war crime. Allied historians debated its strategic value. Survivors on both sides struggled with what it meant and whether it should have happened. But buried in the archives of the controversy were accounts of the rescue efforts. Of prisoners and guards working together. Of bombs and bombers becoming irrelevant next to the immediate reality of human suffering. Of categories dissolving when everything was burning. These accounts didn't resolve the moral questions. Didn't justify the bombing or excuse the camps. Didn't transform enemies into friends or erase the war. They simply added complexity to a story that was easier to understand when kept simple. The prisoners eventually returned home. Some wrote books. Some gave lectures. Some tried to forget. But many spoke about how those 3 days in Dresden had changed how they understood the war. How dropping bombs from 5,000 meters was different from digging through rubble at ground level. How the enemy remained the enemy but became something more dimensional than propaganda allowed. The hatred between prisoners and guards had been real. Built on genuine grievances and actual suffering. The guards had participated in a system that degraded and killed. The prisoners had participated in a bombing campaign that killed civilians. Both were true. Neither cancelled the other. But for 3 days in February 1945, when Dresden was burning and the fence was broken and the guards were gone and the prisoners had remained, they'd worked together. Not because they'd forgiven each other. Not because they'd forgotten why they were enemies. But because the immediate need had exceeded the inherited animosity. And in that gap between hatred and help, in that space where categories dissolved and human need became the only category that mattered, something happened that neither side had expected or wanted or even fully understood. They'd recognized each other. Not as friends. Not as forgiven. But as human beings facing the same crisis. As people who could choose to help despite having every reason not to. That recognition didn't end the war. Didn't empty the camps. Didn't unburn the cities. The war continued for another 3 months. More people died. More bombs fell. The categories reasserted themselves. The prisoners returned to being prisoners. The guards who survived returned to being guards. The hatred remained because the reasons for hatred remained. But underneath, barely visible but impossible to completely erase, was the memory of working together. Of British prisoners helping German doctors. Of German officers organizing rescue parties that included Jews and Poles and Russians. Of Americans and Russians sharing the same buckets. Of enemies becoming something more complicated than enemies without ceasing to be enemies. Those who were there carried that memory for the rest of their lives. It didn't make them friends. It didn't reconcile them to what had been done or excuse what they'd participated in. It simply made the categories more complicated. Made the hatred more difficult to maintain in its pure form. Made the understanding more nuanced than propaganda allowed. In the end, that might have been the real transformation. Not the destruction of Dresden. Not the burning of a city. But the recognition that occurred in the rubble. The understanding that emerged when the fence melted and the guards ran and the prisoners stayed. The realization that people who hated each other could still work together when the alternative was watching everyone die. They hated each other before the bombing. During the bombing. After the bombing. The hatred was earned and justified and real. But for 3 days in February 1945, the hatred became irrelevant. Not erased. Not forgiven. Just irrelevant compared to the immediate need. And that irrelevance, that temporary suspension of enmity in the face of overwhelming crisis, might have been the most honest moment of the war. When propaganda dissolved. When ideology became meaningless. When nothing mattered except whether you could carry a stretcher or dig through rubble or help someone who would have been better off letting you die. That was what happened when they stopped hating. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just work. Just help. Just the recognition that beneath everything else, beneath the uniforms and the wire and the bombs and the flags, were people facing the same fire. And that the fire didn't care which side you'd been on before it started burning.